Yeah, tonight's speaker is Evan Rose, a longtime member of the Mountaineers. I'm sure many of you know him. He told me he got his start adventuring as a Boy Scout out on the East Coast in Delaware. So there are lots of different ways people get into adventuring, but I think Boy Scouts is a pretty common one for people. I met him back in 1999, shortly after I moved here, and turns out that wasn't long after he had moved here too in 1997. Evan took the climbing school after retirement, which I think is kind of unusual, but he did it in order to enable his interest in canyoneering. And I think you all know that he's really milked that for all it's worth, especially since he's retired. So he got his money's worth out of the climbing school, I'm sure. So this is not canyoneering here. This is climbing on the outsides of features rather than the insides. So let's welcome Evan Rose.
Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about my exploration of some volcanic plugs. And what I'll do is I'll give you a short introduction to volcanic plugs, sort of where they are, a little bit about what they are. I'll give you a short windshield tour of the area. And then I'll treat each of the 5 plugs in turn. And so on this introductory slide, you can see I've got my 5 plugs here. There's Cabazon, which is the most famous one. That one the Mountaineers have had several trips to. There was one back in 2010 led by Dennis Brandt, 2014 led by Michael Altair, and then last year I led a trip here as well. Then there's Cerro Cuate. Both of those I did back in December of 2020. Then we've got Cerro de Guadalupe. That's my favorite one. You can see these horns here. Very, very nice feature. It's also the youngest of the 5 that I went up. Then there's Cerro de Santa Clara and Cerro Cochino. So volcanic plugs, what are they? New Mexico has quite a few volcanic features. They're all over the state. So this is a slide that I got from the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. And the red zones are areas of recent volcanic activity. And you can see they generally go from the west part of the state and trend in a northeasterly fashion to the northeast corner of the state, with a few outliers kind of in the center and the south. So I've been to several of these volcanic places, as most of you have probably been as well. Given that the Valles Caldera is in our backyard, we've all seen volcanic features. But I've been to Shiprock in the northwest. It's over here by Farmington. I've been to Capulin, which is up in the northeast. Carrizozo down here in the center. El Malpai and Mount Taylor over here towards the west. There's a real interesting feature called the Kilbourne Hole in the south. That's a volcanic mar, and you can pick up peridot there. And then, of course, the Valles Caldera. So those are the areas, and we're going to be talking about what's labeled here as the Mount Taylor volcanic necks. I'm calling them plugs. They're also called necks. I think neck is the more general term. They're the remnant core of the volcano. So the volcano starts up, it spews out ash and lava. A lot of this is unconsolidated material that erodes fairly easily. But in the center of the volcano, kind of in the throat of the volcano, often there's a very solid piece. And if there's been some liquid lava that has stayed there for a long time, you can have a very hard core. And that really hard core is referred to as a plug. If it hasn't gotten to that state, then it's generally called a neck. But we have quite a few. In this Mount Taylor area, there are several hundred. Some of them are more visible than others. Some have been eroded away, but we'll get to that. So where is this exactly? So here we are in Los Alamos, most of us. Here's Cuba off to the west, and Bernalillo to the south and a little bit west. And then here's Cabazon Peak. So if you were to travel from Bernalillo to Cuba, about halfway, if you went west towards this little town of San Luis, you would end up at Cabazon Peak. So it's fairly close. It's probably, an hour and a half, 2 hours away, very accessible. I went there for the first time back in 2014, and I was intrigued by the idea that there were a lot of peaks there, or plugs there. And I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be fun to bag a bunch of these? Sort of like the theme of people going up to Colorado and doing the 14ers. I thought it'd be fun to do the plugs. So I had some time back in the winter of 2020, and I decided to start this little project. On the right, I do GPS tracks. And here you can see this is CalTopo. So I get a GPS track on my phone. I use an application called Backcountry Navigator. I get the GPS track. I email it to myself. I bring it into CalTopo and I plot it up in CalTopo. And that's been kind of a standard practice of mine for years. And you can see these red lines here are my tracks. It's a good way of documenting trips. And if you haven't tried that yet, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And it leaves a record. Often I find I'll go and look back and I'll try to remember what I did when and what were the details. And this is a great way of doing it. So you make yourself a folder, you throw the GPS track in there, you throw in a little PDF that you can make with CalTopo, and you throw all your photos in there. And sometimes you put in a little narrative and you've got a nice record. So here's a little windshield. I went there in the late afternoon, early evening, and I drove around. So on your way in, if you drive out to Cabazon, here's what Cabazon Peak looks like looking from the north, looking south. And this was a winter day. It's a New Mexico winter, so frequently you can do a lot of things in the winter in New Mexico. And the winter of 2020 was one of those years. So there's Cabazon. Here's what the standard roads look like. They're in pretty good shape for the most part. And in this one, you can see other volcanic plugs. So here's a little plug off in the distance. Another one over here is Guadalupe, one of my favorites. Here's a close-up Cerro de Guadalupe. This one is the youngest of the bunch. And you can see it has some really interesting features that have not eroded away yet. These volcanic plugs are in the neighborhood of 2.5 to 4 million years old. And they should last a few million more years. But they're short-lived in terms of geological time. Here's another picture of Guadalupe. And then at the end of my little drive around before I went to my car camping spot, this is my last view of Cabazon Peak at sunset. Cabazon Peak is just fantastic. You can see it from many miles away, all over this part of the state, and it's very iconic. If you do any of these, Cabazon is the one to do. So here we are. This is the first day doing my first peak. Upper left, you can see this is the registry, and you can get an idea of how much business there is in the winter. You see the 4th of December, the 8th of December, here's some on the 9th. Here's a guy who went out 2 days before me, and I'm the first person out on the 18th. So it's not really heavily traveled. And here are a couple of the denizens, the cattle. This is cattle country. And then here's a burro that happened to be out there. So I camped real close to the trailhead. You can do that. There are lots of little places you can pull off on the road, park your SUV, sleep in the SUV if you want, pitch a tent, however you do it. Sign the registry and off you go. It's a very well marked trail to begin with, and route finding is not that difficult. So here's our first view of Cabazon Peak from the trail. And you can see there's a sort of columnar structure, and that's basalt. This is one of the true plugs. You could call this a neck, but it's also a plug. This had a liquid core for a long time, and it's very well consolidated. So this one will last for a long time. Looking back, you can see some of the other volcanic plugs. This is the one that I'll do in another couple of days. This one here is called Cerro Cuate, and it's variously translated as twin or buddy. It's kind of a slang, but you can see why it's called that, because it has these two peaks that are connected by this ridge. So great views. That's another nice thing about doing these plugs, is you get nice views. And it's winter time. This one over here, I think might be Nuestra Senora. That one is intriguing because it looks really difficult. And that's what I'd like to investigate further in the future for another project. So here, once again, is Cabazon. And you can see these basalt columns here. And then here's kind of a close-up view of that. So what happens is that the basalt solidifies, and then as it cools, it tends to contract and makes these cracks. And the classic basalt column is a hexagon. So you see a lot of these on the hike. So the hike proceeds. It's interesting because this is kind of the trail, and you see it goes up here in this sort of crack arrangement. When you look at Cabazon, you would swear there's no way up, but there is. You walk along the southern part of the plug, and then you start turning northward, and you end up going in from the east, and that's the route. Another view of that, now being at the top in this area, looking down, we're looking down here. Now this is variously described as a class 3 or a low class 4, and some people describe it as a chimney. It's something that is not real hard to do, but it has a little bit of hazard. You don't want to slip in there, but it's not really that difficult. And if you're used to climbing and you have decent holds, where you can make your own decent holes, you'll have an easy time of it. I did meet one older man who didn't go up. His son went up, and he was hanging around and waiting. And when he saw me come down, he was very disappointed in himself because I was older than he was. So anyway, you have to make your own decision about that. And then here the trail comes around. It actually came by this tree. There's a little snow here. So one problem in the winter is sometimes you have to watch your step because it may be snowy. At the top, so you go up that kind of class 3, class 4. There's another little cliff that you have to go up. Not too bad. And then you get to the top, and there's this sort of makeshift shelter up here. And fantastic views, 360-degree views. Here we're looking off to the east, back towards Los Alamos. The other cool thing is there's a lot of lava up there, and here's this kind of ropey lava that's all oxidized into this kind of rust red color. And you can find a lot of this stuff up there. And that's really kind of cool to see. It's not something that you often see, or that I often see in New Mexico. So it's nice to know that you can find that at the top of Cabazon. And we're at about 7,800 feet here. So a little higher than Los Alamos. But the prominence, which is the height from the floor to the top of the plug, is about 2,000 feet. So that gives you fantastic views. So then they kind of recapitulate here. The whole trip, this track that you can see, this red track, is 3.5 miles. Cabazon is an iconic peak. It's got some challenges, it's got great views. For extra credit, there's this little dotted line here, and that's a little trail that you can take around the base. When we went back in April of 2021, a couple of the members of our dozen people who went on the trip did that hike as well, and they had a really good time. I should mention here that this is the only one of the 5 peaks that I did that has an established route. The others have, traces of a trail, I would say, but nothing as established as this one. So this one's a good one. So the next one, this is Cuate, and we could see Cerro Cuate from Cabazon. So now I'm looking north to Cerro Cuate. Here's Cabazon off here to the northeast. And you can see that some of the earlier pictures had lots of snow in them. Well, I decided I would go to the south and go up the south slope of Cerro Cuate, and I'd have a snow-free route to the top. And if you look around, you see, well, here's some arroyos in here, fairly deeply entrenched. And this is Cerro Cuate is off to the left. And so here's one branch coming in here, and here's another branch coming in. This is basically the Rio Puerto system. And in the bottom of this arroyo system, you can see what are actually full-grown trees. And this is about 30 feet deep, fairly steep-sided. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, it's, how bad can it be? It's got to be broken down somewhere. And I'm going to camp out tonight, and in the morning, I'll go up Cerro Cuate. So the next day I started out, and here's part of that trench system in the foreground. And I walked along this for well over a mile, and it showed no signs of having any broken down areas of the bank and no way to get across. So I gave up. I was following along cattle trails, and I figured that if there was a way down, the cattle surely would have found it, but there wasn't a way down. So I was a little disappointed in that. So here I am on the 20th. This was the next day. I decided instead of going from the snow-free south, I go from the snowy north. So now I'm at the north end of Cerro Cuate. Oh, and my plan here is to walk up this ridge, generally, up to the top, and then go along the connecting ridge to the southern peak. And so off I go. So now, here's that northern peak. Here's the ridge going over to the southern peak. And this nice kind of bowl arrangement in here. Very pretty area. And fairly easy hiking, this one was. Here once again, basalt features. A little bit rugged here, but it wasn't bad. You have to use some, hand over hand type climbing to get up there. Here I am at the top of the northern peak. I'm looking south, and there's now this connecting ridge that's going along here to the southern peak. And so I'm going to walk that. A lot of fun, actually. So here I am on that ridge. I'm looking along the ridge. The southern peak is off screen to the left here. Once again, there's Cabazon off in the distance. And then here I am heading towards that southern peak along the ridge. Really fun. Now I've gotten there, and I'm looking back down to the south. So earlier on, I was complaining about that drainage system and the deeply entrenched arroyos. Well, here it is. Here's one branch coming in. Here is the branch I tried to go across. You couldn't see it very well in that other picture because I was down at that level. But I basically camped up in here, walked down, walked along this, found no way down, and went back up this side branch. You can see the road up here, and I basically car camped off of that road kind of in this area. So that gives you some idea about what this area is like. So I'm complaining to myself about this, but I did a little more reading, and it turns out that the reason that we have these exposed volcanic plugs is precisely because the Rio Puerco goes through here. So the Rio Puerco is excavating these plugs. It's taking away lots of this debris and making them visible to us and accessible to us. Otherwise, they'd be choked with lots of debris, and we wouldn't have this this area to play in. And kind of evidence of that is Mesa Chivato is off to the west, and Mesa Prieta is off to the east. And both of those are part of what this whole area used to look like. And they have been unexcavated. They've got lots of volcanoes in them that'll be the plugs of the future. So what I often like to do is go down a different way than I went up. So now I'm going down. I'm coming off on that western side, off the southern peak. And basically, this is all scree here. Lots and lots of loose rock. This is, for a lot of people, not much fun. But it was a different route, and it presented a different kind of challenge. I had a good time. And then here's looking down. I basically went down this ridge over here and got back to my car. This is ranch land. You can see some buildings just barely make them out down here. Believe it or not, cattle can survive here, if not thrive. So let's do a little recap of that. So I parked up here on the road. Remember, I tried going in from the south. That didn't work. And so I drove up here to the north, and I hiked in, went up that ridge, went across the connecting ridge, and then I went back down the scree slope. Okay, so I thought I might do a safety minute. As I'm mentioning here, I'm doing a solo hike. Solo hikes are something I like to do. I do them a lot. And it may well be that you would like to do a solo hike too. And I'd like to just spend a little time giving a sort of a warning or a caution. Let's call it a caution. So on the right, you can see this was a hike I took in August of 2020. And this was out in Colorado. I did this hike up to what's called Wilson Peak. And then I decided I would do kind of a finishing, second hike. And I hiked this long ridge over here to Gladstone. And you remember I was talking about scree and loose rock. Well, it turns out this is sort of the capital of scree and loose rock. And right here, I had a fall. And I did this to my leg. So there's my ankle, my right ankle, and I broke it. So I scooted down this mountain and I walked myself back to my tent. It was about 2 miles and it took about 6 hours. And then the next day I walked out. That was about 7 miles and took about 10 hours. And then I drove home to Trinity Urgent Care, and they took care of me. So what did I do correct? Well, I managed to self-rescue. I did have a phone, but this is a fairly inaccessible area. Once you're down here and you hike out, there are a lot of people around, so you're no longer at risk. I listened to a show called The Sharp End, which talks about accidents in North American climbing. And I took some pointers from that. So I had a helmet on, I had backpack, I had food, I had water, I had clothing, I had the phone, but I didn't use it. I had 2 headlamps, which I did use. I had a first aid kit. I did not at that time have a SAMS card, and I advise people to have that. I now own a Garmin InReach, and that's another thing that can really help, especially if you're out of cell phone coverage. So that's, I don't want to belabor this, but anyway, that was my experience, and it got okay. So let's see. Now we'll return to the volcanic plug. So this one is Cerro de Santa Clara. And this one is pretty nice. I would say of the 5 plugs I did, this was the easiest one. It's got a real interesting feature. Here in the foreground, you can see there are 2 colored rocks, and it's basically a basalt layer that's been deposited on another layer, which may have been there before this volcano erupted. For this one, you can go off to the right and follow a gentle ridge, and that'll take you up to the top. Once you're at the top, it's really cool because now you've got great views of the other mountains. This one here is my favorite, Guadalupe. And what's interesting about this is that you can actually see the ascent route. You're going to come around here, along this cliff, up here, and then you'll climb up to the top. The worst part is this little climb in here, but it's showing the route. And that's kind of cool. So I'll be there doing that the next day. And then here's a view looking up the Rio Puerco drainage. This is the river. Not much flowing here now, but when it does flow, it takes away a tremendous amount of silt and just excavates this whole area. And over here is Cerro Pate. That was the one I was on back in December. We're looking from the south. And once again, our favorite Cabazon Peak. Often when I go up these mountains, I like to come down a different route. And so I'll go up, like I did on Cerro Pate. I came down a different way than I went up. So here I'm looking for another way down. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, I came down this, it dead ended. I had to go back up. That was okay. It's an explorer. This is on the peak, walking around the peak. Lots of cholla bushes. Here's some nice rock formations. Once again, this kind of basalt that breaks up. In this case, it's like a bunch of little bricks. And then here is another way down. It goes through this little gap, this little gate in the rocks. So that's part of the joy of going up these things. I should say that one of the advantages of doing these solo trips is you can do what you want, and you don't have to please anyone else. If you take a fancy to do a different thing, you can do it. If you decide you're going to call it off for the day and go back early, you can do it. It gives you a lot of freedom. So then here's my route. I basically started down here at the road. I came up, I followed this long ridge, played around on the top for a while. I went along here looking for another way down. That way didn't work. I came around here, this way didn't work. And so I came back, and then I went through that little gate that I showed you and worked my way down to the bottom. So lots of fun. This one, like I said, easy ascent up the South Ridge, nice views of the other volcanoes. If you had to do one and you don't mind doing a little route finding, this one was the easiest of the 5. Okay, so now to my acclaimed favorite This one is Guadalupe. I love it just because it is so rugged and so steep, and it has these wonderful little horns everywhere. I just think it is just a beautiful mountain. So I went up this one the next day. This is the day after Santa Clara. And this one is at least as rugged as Cabazon. And it has more route finding because people have been here and you can see where they've been, but there's no real established trail. So you're walking along and you're doing this sort of thing here. That's part of the trail. You're walking along something like this. You're going past features like this one here. Beautiful views. Once again, this is looking out in the Rio Puerco area. More sections of the trail, as it were. You can see along here, there's a bit of trail, and then you're basically curving around here, and then you're going to go up. There's a little bit of hand over hand here. If I did this one again, I think I would bring some cord, just so that I could tie myself a little hand line. I think it would be a little more reassuring, especially when you're by yourself. And then once again, another beautiful view down. This was an area, I went over here to see if I could find another route down, and this is basically a cliff here. So there is no other way down here. I had to go back the way I came. But I really like the contrast in the colors. You've got this tan down below, and then this really black rock, volcanic. So here's my route. There's a road over here just off screen. Hiked in. I did the spiral, hike around, and then I retraced my way. There was that one place where I cliffed out. That was about here, where these lines seem to touch. There's a good drop there. It's well over 100 feet. It didn't look climbable to me. One interesting thing about this, I'm using this CalTopo app, and they have a feature called slope shading. So what you're seeing here is all this purplish to black is extremely steep terrain. The yellow is pretty mild. The red is a little steeper. And so you can see that this mountain is just surrounded on three sides by very steep terrain. Very nice. So spiral route to the top, 2.5 miles, rugged beauty, steep with some class 3. So be prepared for that. Okay, so that was number 4. We're going on to number 5. So number 5 is Cochino. So Cochino is one of the less picturesque ones. It looks in a way kind of like a lump, but it has some interesting features to it, and I will get to that immediately. In the other ones, I showed you my route at the end. To understand Cochino, you have to see the route at the beginning. So remember, I was talking about this application, this CalTopo. So all of this gray is mild, very mild slope. There's a little bit of steep stuff down here, but then it's real mild. So you go walking on this mild stuff. All of a sudden, it gets steep. So here's this mountain, basically a ridge-shaped mountain sticking out of fairly tame, low angle slope, and gets real steep. So I come walking along, I see this thing, and I start up. And you can see all these little wiggles here. I'm going back and forth, trying to find my way up through this. Basically, it's a cliff band. And the way things are set up, it forced me off to the north. And then I followed a ridge up to the top. Well, on the way back, you get to the top and you look over the other side, and there's none of this purpley stuff here. It's all kind of yellow and pink. Well, this is actually the better way to come up if you don't want the challenge. And so it's a slog, well, a struggle to get up, but it's a stroll to get back down. And that was kind of fun to discover that. So here's the bottom. There were a little bit of that steep stuff, and this is all pretty much just dirt and loose rock. And then here's looking up at that steep part where it's basalt columns. It's steep, there are cliff bands, and this is a representative part of that. And when you get to the top, it's a forest of cholla cactus. And I thought this was really interesting. I hadn't seen this much cholla at the top of any of these peaks, but this was covered with it. If you turned around, it was a 360 forest of chollas. That was kind of cool. And from the top, this is looking generally north. You can see now Cerro Guadalupe sticking up. See how steep it is. And then behind it is Cerro Santa Clara, much gentler. And that was the easy one of the five. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. On this final slide, I'm basically repeating the first one, but now I'm putting in the altitudes for the peaks, each of these peaks. Okay, there we are.
Great, awesome, thank you. Sorry, my husband's cooking in the background. If anybody can hear that, I apologize. Okay, let's see. Let me go back a little bit. There. So Rick Kelly did interject and say that really interesting, like coiled rock that you had a picture of, that is called a volcanic bomb. And it's basically lava that cooled while spinning in the air.
Oh, really?
Yes, very cool.
I'm glad he said something, because it was my impression that it just got pushed out of a vent somewhere. So that's good to know.
Mine too, for sure. Did you have a Garmin with you when you fell?
So on this trip that I'm showing now, I had my Garmin. This was what, 4 months after I fell. And on that trip, I did not have a Garmin. After that, I immediately bought one. I should mention that there are 2 big reasons to have emergency communications. One reason for emergency communication is so that you can get help for yourself. The other is a little more subtle, and that's respect for your loved ones, because it is nerve-wracking and very distressing for your loved ones to be out of communication with you and worried about what has happened to you. And so I would say that I got the Garmin in equal measure.
I realize I was muted. Thank you for that clarification. I have a couple coming through now. What kind of camera do you take with you?
Okay, so I have a camera that I've had for a long time. It's an Olympus, Olympus Tough, and it's actually one of the older models. And this thing, waterproof and drop proof, and I have beat the heck out of this thing. I actually bought a more modern one to replace it, because I can see the end is coming. But I take this one on all my trips, including my canyoneering trips. And the fact is, it's waterproof, and so I can take it into the wet canyons with me, and it doesn't need any extra protection.
Nice. Okay.
So I would say Olympus Tough.
Olympus, got it. Cool, great. Okay, there's a thank you from Sylvie for sharing local New Mexico with us. Of the Rio Puerco plugs that you didn't climb, oops, what are the next most interesting challenges?
Yeah, so there's one that's called Nuestra Senora. You get the whole thing here. Cerro Nuestra Senora de las Lagunitas de la Luz. And that one has me fascinated. I could see it off in the distance. It looks really, it looks at least as challenging as Cabazon. But like with Cabazon, you don't know that you can get to the top of it unless you do some research and you find out, well, there's a trail. And there may be a trail to the top of this one. So that's the one I'm going to look at next.
Okay, awesome. And then Michael says it's worth mentioning that the club has a couple of units for loan. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, the club did buy some Garmin InReach. I believe they're the minis that can be borrowed by club members on their trips.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, good to know. Thank you. Okay, did you have problems with local people near the peaks?
I did not. There's some ranching communities out there.
Mhm.
The closest I came really to private land was Cerro Cuate.
Mhm.
And if you look at the map, you can see that there is kind of a jumble of private and public land. And so I found a place in the north that was public. I parked there and then I walked. There are some fences there. I did not go over any fences, open any gates or any of that. But I think you would, as an individual, you'd have to do a little research and also consider your own comfort level about possibly encroaching on private land. And so as far as I know, I was always on public land, and I try to do that. I hope that answers the question.
I think it did. Just a clarification, a couple of people sent this in. There are all of the lamb gear that is part of the group is actually just for mountaineer trips. Yeah, just a clarification.
Yes. Yes, it's club gear for club members.
Right, and specifically, I think they're trying to clarify for like just during club trips.
Yes. If you were to say, hey, I want to go out and do something this weekend, I'll take the club gear. That's really not quite proper.
Got it. Cool. So this is part of that, a second part of that question about local people. And did you need high clearance to get into parking areas?
No, you don't. This came up when I went to Cabazon with our trip in April. I was advising people to bring high clearance vehicles, but it turned out they didn't really need it. If you have like a Subaru Outback, you can definitely get in there. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So are you planning to lead any trips for the club anytime soon to this area?
Let's see. I hadn't planned any for this area. It would be very easy to do, though. I think Guadalupe would be fun. There are possibilities here.
Awesome. Good to know.
But I don't have any current plans yet.
Okay, great. Good to know. Did you find any petroglyphs or ruins around these?
Okay. So earlier on, when I was talking about trying to get up to Cerro Cuate, I realized I couldn't get across the deep arroyos.
Mhm.
And I ended up going south, and there's a ruin called Guadalupe. Guadalupe's all over. That name is all
Sure.
over.
Yep.
If you go probably a dozen or so miles south, there's a ruin down there. And it's very interesting. You basically go up on top of a mesa, and there are some shelters to preserve some of the ruins there. Highly recommended. Not heavily visited at all. It's kind of at a dead end road. There is a road that looks like it goes through, but I tried doing that and it stops at the gates of a ranch, and it does not go through. But anyway, there are some ruins out there, but I didn't see any petroglyphs on any of these flyers.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions? There's some pointers in the chat for different land ownership maps and different units you can use for safety, which is great. Thank you everyone for sharing that. I think that seems to be the end of the questions. Awesome. So thank you, Evan. Thanks for sharing those trips with us. Those seem amazing. I want to hike them now. That's for sure. So yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Perfect. So I hope everyone enjoyed this talk this evening. I know I did. Please look out for a peak evaluation that will come into your inbox in the next couple days. Let us know what you liked about this program. And if you want to join us, Peak, for another upcoming event, we have our weekly astronomy talk that is in person this Friday evening. All right, so thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. Have a great evening. Thank you so much, Evan.
You're welcome. Good night.
Good night.